welcome to the Drexel interview. I'm your host, Paula Morantz-Cohen, speaking to you from the university's Picture Gallery. Today our guest is social critic and technologist Stephen Johnson. Stephen Johnson is the author of several books on popular culture and learning, including Mind Wide Open, The Connected Lives of Ants, Brains, Cities, and Software, and his most recent book, The Ghost Map, the story of London's most terrifying epidemic. He's also the author of the provocatively titled bestseller, Everything Bad is Good for You, How Today's Popular Culture is Actually Making Us Smarter. Stephen Johnson, welcome to the Drexel interview.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, your book, Everything Bad is Good for You, which I would like to concentrate on for this interview. It's so interesting, and it touches on so many points that I think our viewers would be interested in. In any case, you start that book with a little quote from the Woody Allen 1973 film Sleeper, in which, Woody Allen has been frozen and he's woken up in the future, and the scientists who are tending to him are talking about the fact that now deep fat and heavy cream are healthy for you, where before, of course, it was tofu and sprouts or whatever. And I guess your point being that popular wisdom can be radically wrong. And I guess my first question is a very general one. Do you think that's true? Do you think that, generally speaking, popular wisdom can be very, very wrong?
Yeah, I think it can. And in some ways, there's a funny theme that runs through a bunch of the books. The new book, The Ghost Map, has a long section on this where I try to look at the whole history of big mistakes that people have made. When society makes a mistake for a long period of time, why does that happen? When we teach the history of ideas and the history of culture, we tend to focus on the great breakthroughs and the moments of insight or inspiration, or when people suddenly got things right. Mm-hmm. But sometimes it's just as fun to go back and look at why people were wrong for so long and what kept them in the dark for so long, what kept them confused for so long. I don't think this is the only deliberately contrarian book that I've written, and I think you can get too cute. You run the risk of reversing sometimes the conventional wisdom is conventional because it's right.
Right.
But I think in this case, there was grounds for the argument that I tried to make.
Okay, well, let's get to your argument. Now, your argument being that, and I guess video games is the most obvious place to start, because that's where people are, the popular wisdom is that it is really mindless, repetitive, useless diversion.
Right.
And you think not. And I guess the first question I would say, you talk about delayed gratification.
Yeah.
Address that and video games.
I would say, the popular wisdom is that it's even worse than useless, because in some cases, because of the violence question. Uh-huh. People are saying it's actually creating a generation of, felons. So it's not even, if it was just, mindless diversion, people would be fine.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you that, this, in a way, the beginning of the book and the beginning of my interest in exploring games in this way dates back to this story where I was on a vacation with my family, and I had a 7-year-old nephew, and it was a rainy day. We were at the beach. It was a rainy day, and he was getting a little stir-crazy, and so I thought, well, I'll show him this video game that I've been playing, and the game was SimCity. It was about the third iteration of SimCity, and a lot of people have seen SimCity, but basically you're basically a mix between a big city planner and a mayor. So you can build highways and zone for industrial development, and you create, schools and parks and things like that. It's a wonderful game, one of the best-selling games in the history of games. And so I showed it to my nephew Wyatt, who's 7 at this point, and I give him basically a very condescending tour of the game, pretty much a tour of the graphics of the game. This is my house, and look at that tall building there, Wyatt, and all this kind of stuff. And at a certain point, I show him this area where I have all these rundown factories. And I say to him, I can't get these factories to turn on. Look, this one's abandoned, and this one looks like it's about to be abandoned. And Wyatt kind of looks at the screen, he looks back at me, and he goes, I think you need to lower your industrial tax rates. And I just realized it was one of those moments where your world just kind of turns a little bit. And I said, God, he's learning this very complex lesson about industrial taxation and development, and he's 7. And if you sat him down in an urban planning classroom and tried to teach him these things, he would be asleep in 2 seconds. But something about the nature of the game was getting him, kind of pulled into this. And I knew there were a lot of other games like SimCity, and that games had grown dramatically in their complexity and the kinds of experiences that they offered kids from when I was a kid when we were playing Pac-Man and Donkey Kong. And yet every time I looked around to see what the kind of cultural commentators were saying about gaming culture, it's exactly as you described it. It's dumbing kids down, it's violent, it's gratuitous, it's mindless.
Well, I mean, you didn't use a good example with SimCity.
Right,
I mean, SimCity is the one game that parents have been encouraged to give their kids because it's educational.
Yes.
But then there are the other games. There are the games that are violent, that do involve repetitive motion. And talk to us about those and what you think what's the value there.
The problem, I think, is that we've had a skewed sense of how dominant the violent games are. If you look at the breakdown in sales, and I'm not talking about educational titles. The best-selling game of all time is The Sims, right? So the sequel to SimCity, where you manage a household and a family. You know, what you do in The Sims is household chores all day long, which is pretty funny. And so those types of simulation games probably make up, 25% of the market. There's one called Civilization that's even more complex than SimCity. And these are big best-selling games. And then you have, kind of puzzle-like games, Tetris games, and they make up a small portion. Then you have kind of adventure games. There's a series called Zelda. It sells tons of copies. Nothing really violent about it. It involves slightly different skills, but it's very complicated. You follow a very complicated quest. You have many objectives that you have to go through over the course of the game. You have to manage all your different objectives and plan out your kind of strategy for moving through the space of the game. And then you have the sports simulations, which are now so complicated that you're managing an entire organization. You have a budget each year. You trade players. You call all the plays. And then you actually execute the plays and play in the games. So all of those games, that's right there, that's probably 85% of the market of popular games sold every year. Then there's the 15% that is Grand Theft Auto and Quake and Doom and games that are more violent. Grand Theft Auto is a very complicated game in the sense that the world is very rich that you're exploring. It has a much more complicated level of satire than people realize. But there's no denying it's not a game for a 12-year-old to play. It's a game in the game world like a Martin Scorsese movie. It's violent, it's tough, it's gritty, it has a dark sense of humor, and it's not appropriate for kids on some level. But we've made our peace with that with other forms of entertainment. We understand that Scorsese is not appropriate for children, but we don't use that as a reason to say all movies must be banned.
So it's a violent game, but it's not a dumb game.
That's right.
Yeah.
I happen to think there are some dumb violent games. Grand Theft Auto is not one of them.
And the popular ones tend not to be dumb, would you say?
It's a mix. I mean, I think there's a genre of kind of first-person shooter games where you are literally, and they say it like this because you just see the gun as you're kind of roaming around, and Quake and Doom are the kind of original versions of this. And they've gotten more complicated over time. But I don't see anything particularly redeeming in what those games offer. But the problem was the popular perception of what was actually being played by the kids was so dominated by those games, and people didn't realize that there was all this other kind of interesting stuff that was happening. And so I wrote the book to kind of celebrate and shine some light on that part of the popular culture.
Well, okay, in terms of the problem-solving element, they complicate, putting the violence aside, because I think you make a good point that we have the violence in all the other media, and why focus on it here.
Yep.
What is it then in the games that is sophisticated or that develops, and in fact you say it's not just that they develop problem-solving capabilities, but unique problem-solving capabilities. Could you explain a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one way to think about it is to start with a game that we've already accepted is good for you on some level, which is chess. So when you never hear parents complaining about how much chess their kids are playing, right? We said they send their kids to chess camp, and that's because we think that there's something not in the content of chess. There's not a narrative to chess that you learn lessons from, and there's no direct experience that's applicable to a job that you get from chess. But we think that there's something from the kind of thinking that you're doing when you're playing chess that's good for the mind and strengthens your kind of cognitive abilities in some general way. And that's why kids are encouraged to play chess. So what I was trying to say, when you play a game, say, a simulation-style game, what you're trying to do, you have to get inside the mind of the gamer at that point. And what they're thinking about in a game like that is they're thinking, I've got 25 different objectives. I'm trying to steer this little simulation towards, let's say it's a game like a railroad tycoon kind of game where you're managing a big railroad, big popular game. You're trying to figure out, okay, I want my company, my railroad company, to succeed in these following ways that I've defined. I know that there are these potential threats that I've got. I know I have these resources available to me. I know that if I reach these particular objectives, I'm going to have more resources. And I know that the geography that I'm trying to conquer with my railroad is built up with these limitations. And I'm figuring out if I kind of lay these tracks here and build this station here, I'll make more money here, and I can transfer it over here, and I can buy this train here, and then I'll get to this ultimate goal, which I've set for myself based on my own interests and terms. Now, that's a very high-level form of thinking. That's the way that we think in the real world when we're trying to think about what we're going to do for a living and how we're going to manage our resources and where we're going to spend our money and where we're going to allocate our time and all that kind of stuff. It is not the kind of thinking that happens when we read a novel. And I'm a huge fan of reading novels. I went to grad school in English literature. I read 100 19th century novels, and they had a huge impact on me. And kids should be reading novels. But when you are sitting there reading a story and immersing yourself in a narrative line, that's a very rich way of thinking. But when you're sitting there trying to build a little world for yourself and manage all those different objectives and manage those resources, that's a very rich way of thinking as well. And so as educators and as parents, we need to be able to recognize that there's value in both those kinds of thought. Okay.
Let me, though, play devil's advocate with you a little bit here. First of all, there is an addictive quality to gaming. And the idea that you can, the ideal that we would read books and we would also play games, it does seem that playing these games pushes out everything else. I mean, it pushes out book reading, certainly, but maybe even going outside and playing as well. There is something about those games, maybe because of the kind of immersion that they require, that is so personal, that I think makes it different in kind. And there it could be dangerous, it seems to me.
I think if there's anything in the book, I did talk about addiction in the book, and I talked a little bit about why the addiction happens, actually. And I think there's some interesting kind of neuroscience about why this happens. Because part of what you want to understand is it's hard enough, think about something like The Sims, it's hard enough to get your kids to do chores in the real world. Why are they willing to do them on the screen? You literally have to take the garbage out when you play The Sims. So your 16-year-old won't do it in real life, but they will go upstairs in their room and do it on the screen. So why are kids willing to take the kind of focus that these games require? They take an immense amount of concentration. And they take an immense amount of time, as you alluded to. And so there is something addictive about the form of these games that pulls people in, that keeps them focused and willing to commit to the amount of energy and time and mental effort that goes into building these worlds and sharing these worlds. So when I look back at Everything Bad Is Good for You as a book, like the one thing I wish I had done slightly differently is I should have, while I talked about addiction, I should have flagged that a bit more and said, of all the concerns out there about games, addiction is the one that probably does deserve some concern and the parents should be looking out for. The concerns about them being a total waste of time, no, they aren't a total waste of time. They're much better than the television that I was watching in 1979 as a kid. There's no question in my mind that a kid playing even Grand Theft Auto is better off than watching Three's Company, which is what I was doing as a kid. And violence, I think, is not nearly the problem it's been rumored to be, and all these other things. But addiction is, and I think part of it is, it varies dramatically from genre to genre. There's a huge, massively diverse ecosystem of game genres. The difference between Tetris and Grand Theft Auto and World of Warcraft, which is a kind of a networked game that people play, kind of networked together all around the world, and SimCity is far larger than the difference between different genres of Hollywood movies, because the gameplay is, the rules of the experience are totally different. So, for instance, one of the things that's happened since the book came out, the Nintendo Wii came out, and the Wii is really all about physicality. It's not actually about kind of logical problem solving. It's about moving around in space because you have this extraordinary control.